The grave was moving. Every morning, the soil rose higher, as if something buried beneath refused to stay down. He paid guards, cameras, even scientists. None could explain it. And when the truth finally surfaced, the billionaire collapsed to his knees, screaming, "Hello, my amazing family and friends. I'm so glad you're here with me again today. If you're ready to dive into another powerful story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me the country or city you're watching from. And guess what? Tomorrow, I've got another story lined up that will leave you just as captivated, so don't miss it. Now, let's get started. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that made the air feel heavy, almost unbearable. The graveyard lay beneath a silver moon, and the fog crawled low across the ground like something alive, hiding the tombstones in an eerie veil. At the far corner, away from the path most visitors took, stood a marble headstone taller than the rest. Its letters, carved with cold precision, read, "Amelia Harrington, beloved daughter. Too beautiful for this world." But it wasn't the stone that made hearts tremble. It was the ground before it. The soil had shifted again. It was as though the earth itself was breathing, pushing upward, swelling as though secrets beneath demanded to be known. At that moment, a tall figure stood there, his expensive black overcoat catching the night breeze, his eyes bloodshot from countless sleepless nights. His name was Alexander Harrington, a billionaire industrialist, a man who had bent nations with his wealth and power. Yet here, in front of his daughter's grave, he was powerless. For 3 weeks, he had visited daily, and every time the grave seemed larger, as though it was growing. At first, he thought it was just the ground settling. But no, the soil was fresh each time, as though someone had been there at night, digging, tampering, disturbing her rest. He had hired security guards to watch. He had installed surveillance cameras. He had even gone as far as to bring forensic experts. But each morning, despite their efforts, he returned to find the grave higher, the soil looser, like a hand had reached from beneath. And it haunted him, because Alexander was not just a grieving father. He was a man haunted by guilt. Amelia had been the light of his life, his only daughter, his miracle child born after years of his wife's miscarriages. But he had failed her. Money had bought her every comfort: private tutors, a mansion to live in, toys that most children could only dream of. But what Amelia wanted most was time with her father. And that was the one thing Alexander never gave. Business consumed him. Power seduced him. Amelia's birthdays often came with flowers and expensive gifts, but no warm hugs. Her piano recitals went uncheered, her school plays unphotographed. And the one night she begged him not to leave, he left anyway, choosing a billion-dollar deal over her trembling voice on the phone. That same night, Amelia's fever spiked. By morning, she was gone. Now here he was, drowning in remorse, staring at a grave that refused to rest. The night deepened. A rustling sound pulled him from his thoughts. He turned sharply, heart pounding. Out from the shadows, a frail old woman emerged. Her back was bent, her hands shaking as she clutched a lantern. Her face was worn by time, her eyes clouded with age, yet carrying a strange sharpness. "Mr. Harrington," she whispered, her voice rough like dry leaves. "Still here?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Callahan, I told you, you don't have to watch over this place at night." Mrs. Callahan was the cemetery's keeper, a woman who had tended graves for over 40 years. She knew every corner of the land, every soul buried beneath it. To her, this place was not morbid but sacred. But tonight, she looked unsettled. "I've told you before," she said, her bony finger pointing toward Amelia's grave. "There's something unnatural about this. The earth don't move like this on its own. Not without a reason." Alexander bristled. "You think I don't know that? I've paid guards, installed cameras, even called in specialists. Nobody has answers." Mrs. Callahan stepped closer, lowering her lantern toward the disturbed soil. The fresh dirt glistened, damp as though dug recently. Her lips trembled. "Maybe you're looking in the wrong place for answers, sir. Science won't explain this. Sometimes the dead don't rest when the living leave too much unfinished." Alexander's chest tightened. He hated when she spoke like that. It scraped against the rational part of him, the part that built skyscrapers and conquered industries. But in his heart, guilt twisted like a knife. He turned to leave, but Mrs. Callahan's voice followed him into the night. "She loved you, you know, more than anyone. But love like that doesn't just vanish in the grave. It lingers. And sometimes, it cries out until it's heard. The following morning, Alexander sat in his penthouse office overlooking the city skyline. The empire he had built gleamed beneath him, towers of steel and glass stretching for miles. But for the first time in his life, none of it mattered. His assistant entered quietly, laying down a folder with security reports from the cemetery. Once again, the guards had seen nothing. The cameras showed only darkness, fog, and the occasional flicker of movement too vague to identify. It was driving him mad. Frustrated, Alexander slammed the report shut. His empire had faced hostile takeovers, lawsuits, even government crackdowns, and he had always won. But against a mound of shifting dirt, he was utterly defeated. And that humiliation was unbearable. By afternoon, he drove himself back to the cemetery, refusing the chauffeur, refusing company. He needed to see it for himself in daylight. As he approached Amelia's grave, his steps slowed. There, kneeling by the mound, was a child. A girl no older than 9, with tangled hair and a faded dress, her tiny hands smoothing the soil as though she were tucking it in like a blanket. "Hey!" Alexander barked, rushing forward. The girl startled, her eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. For a second, he froze, because her eyes, those bright, searching blue eyes, were identical to Amelia's. "Who are you?" he demanded. The girl clutched a small teddy bear to her chest, backing away. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean no harm. What are you doing here?" His voice cracked between anger and desperation. The girl hesitated, glancing at the grave. "I come here every day. I didn't want her to feel lonely." Alexander's breath caught. "You knew my daughter?" The girl shook her head. "No, sir. But I heard about her. And when I saw her grave looking so sad, I thought, maybe she needed someone to talk to. Someone to keep her company." For a long moment, Alexander could not speak. This frail child, with nothing but a stuffed toy, had done what he, a billionaire with endless resources, had failed to do: give Amelia his time. Tears pricked his eyes, but he blinked them away. His voice came out rough. "What's your name, girl?" "Lila," she whispered. And in that instant, something shifted inside Alexander Harrington. He didn't know it yet, but this little girl was the key to the mystery, the link between his guilt and the grave's restless growing. And the truth, when it finally revealed itself, would break him in ways that no fortune, no empire, could ever mend. The late afternoon sun dipped lower as Alexander stood before the strange little girl. The cemetery stretched quiet and endless around them, but somehow the silence felt heavier with her presence. Lila clutched her teddy bear like a lifeline, her knuckles white with nervousness, her wide eyes flicking between Alexander and the mound of dirt that had once again risen overnight. For a man who had stood in boardrooms across continents, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and silenced hostile rivals with the mere flick of a pen, it was absurd that he now struggled to form words in front of a child. Finally, his voice cracked out. "Lila, do your parents know you're here?" She shook her head. "I don't got parents." The words were blunt. She said them without a tear, without hesitation, but they cut through Alexander like glass. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped. There was something about the way she stared at him, steady, unflinching, that made him feel as though she could see through his polished suit, through his expensive watch, through every layer of power he wore like armor. "You live near here?" he asked finally. She nodded toward the row of old houses just beyond the cemetery wall. "An aunt, sometimes. But she don't really notice when I'm gone." Alexander frowned. He didn't know what bothered him more: that a child wandered into graveyards without supervision, or that this strange girl seemed more comfortable here than in her own home. He turned back, toward the grave. The soil still looked freshly stirred. "Tell me the truth, Lila. Do you know why this keeps happening? Why the ground," he swallowed, "grows?" Lila bit her lip. Her gaze lingered on Amelia's name carved in stone. "Maybe she just misses you." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. His throat tightened, and he wanted to protest, to scoff, to dismiss it as childish nonsense. But deep inside, something in him trembled because those words carried a truth he feared. That night, Alexander sat alone in the Harrington penthouse. The city sparkled beneath him, alive with lights, but all he could see was the hollow reflection of his face in the window. His staff had laid out dinner: roast lamb, fine wine, but the food lay untouched. He poured himself drink after drink, but nothing dulled the ache. He thought of Amelia, her laughter echoing through the hallways when she was little, her small hands tugging his sleeve, begging him to stay just once, and read her a bedtime story. Her voice on the phone the night she died, whispering, "Daddy, don't go." And then he thought of Lila, kneeling by the grave, brushing the soil as if tucking Amelia in for the night. How could a child with nothing give more love to his daughter's memory than he ever gave while she was alive? The guilt swelled in his chest until it burned. The next day, he returned to the cemetery. He found Lila sitting cross-legged before the grave, humming softly to her teddy bear. The sight pierced him in a way he couldn't explain. "You're here again," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "She doesn't like being alone." He crouched down, lowering himself to the level of this fragile little girl. "Tell me, Lila, what makes you so sure?" She glanced at him, her eyes bright but sad. "Because I know what it feels like." Alexander felt his throat tighten. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't have to. Those few words carried a lifetime of loneliness. After a long silence, he said, "Would you like something to eat? Proper food." Her eyes lit up for the first time. "Do you mean like pizza?" He chuckled bitterly. For all his billions, he had never once asked his own daughter what she liked to eat. Yes, like pizza. So for the first time, Alexander Harrington left the cemetery not in grief, but with a small hand tucked inside his own. They drove into the city, and he took Lila to one of the finest restaurants. But when the maitre d' pulled out menus of exquisite dishes, Alexander shook his head. "Bring us a pizza," he said firmly, stunning the staff. Lila ate with a hunger that broke his heart. Watching her, Alexander realized something. Money, luxury, grand gestures, none of it mattered. All Amelia had ever wanted was this. Presence. Time. Someone who cared. Over the next week, Alexander found himself returning not only to Amelia's grave, but also to Lila. He learned that she lived in a crumbling house with an aunt who barely noticed her existence. She wore the same faded dress each day. Her shoes were worn thin, and yet, her spirit burned bright with something Alexander had lost long ago, innocence. He began buying her food, then new clothes. But Lila never asked for anything. She never reached for the luxuries he offered. The only thing she wanted was to sit by Amelia's grave and talk. And strangely, Alexander found himself joining her. Day after day, they sat there together, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories. Lila told him about school, about the stories she made up in her head to keep herself company. Alexander found himself telling her about Amelia, stories he had never told anyone, memories he had buried under steel and numbers. And slowly, the grave that once haunted him became a place of healing. Yet, each morning, the soil still shifted. The grave continued to grow. One evening, as the sky darkened, Mrs. Callahan approached them. Her lantern glowed against the rising fog. Her face creased with something like fear. "Mr. Harrington," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You need to know something." Alexander looked up, his patience thin. "If this is another lecture about the dead not resting, I've heard enough." "No," she said firmly, her hand shaking as she held out an old, dirt-stained envelope. "This isn't about what I believe. This is about what I found." He frowned, taking the envelope. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed with age, edges crumbling. "It was under the grave," Mrs. Callahan explained. "I don't know how it got there. I was tending the soil, and it came up as though the ground was pushing it out." Alexander's pulse quickened as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, neat, filled with the innocence of childhood. It was Amelia's. He read aloud, his voice trembling. "Dear Daddy, I don't want you to be sad. I don't want you to feel bad. I just wish you'd stayed with me more. But I know you're busy. I love you anyway. Maybe one day, we can sit together and just be happy. Maybe one day you'll really see me." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. His knees gave way, and he sank into the dirt, clutching the fragile letter. Mrs. Callahan's lantern flickered. "Do you see now, Mr. Harrington? The grave is not just soil. It's her love. It's unfinished. It's trying to reach you." Lila's small voice broke the silence. "Maybe she's still waiting. For you." Alexander sobbed openly, his mask of control shattering. For the first time in decades, he wept not as a billionaire, not as a tycoon, but as a father who had failed his child. And as his tears fell onto the soil, the ground seemed to shift again. growing higher, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. That night, as Alexander drove Lila back to her aunt's house, his mind raced. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. Amelia's words gnawed at him. The grave was not just a reminder of death. It was a demand for love he had never given. And though he didn't know how, he swore to himself he would not run from it again. For the first time, Alexander Harrington decided he would stay. He would listen. He would face the truth, no matter how painful. And in the days that followed, he began to notice something else, something chilling. Lila knew more about Amelia than she should have. Details she couldn't possibly know. Favorite songs. Favorite flowers. Phrases Amelia used to say as a child. It was impossible. Terrifying. And yet, Alexander could not shake the thought. Could Lila and Amelia's restless grave be connected in ways that defied reason? The Harrington mansion, with all its glass and steel and silent corridors, had never felt so cold. Alexander paced his study that night. Amelia's letter spread across his desk. The handwriting danced before his eyes, each curve of her pen stabbing into him like a knife. He reached for the decanter of bourbon, but set it back down, fingers trembling. For the first time in years, he didn't want to drown the ache. He wanted to feel it. He needed to. But more than that, he needed answers. Lila's face lingered in his mind. Her small, careful smile, her voice when she had said Amelia's name as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And those little details, things Alexander had never spoken aloud. How could she possibly know? The next morning, Alexander didn't go to his office. The board could wait. The markets could crash. For the first time in decades, none of it mattered. He drove instead to the cemetery. Lila was already there. She sat with her teddy bear in her lap, humming softly as she plucked small daisies from the grass and laid them one by one on Amelia's grave. He watched her for a long moment, something tightening in his chest. Then he approached. "You shouldn't be here alone so much," he said gently. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp and knowing for a child. "Neither should you." The words cut deep. He swallowed hard and crouched beside her. "Lila, how do you know so much about my daughter?" She tilted her head. "What do you mean? You mentioned her favorite flowers. Her song. You said things only she would know." Lila hugged her bear tighter. For the first time, she looked uncertain, as if caught in a secret. "Sometimes I hear her." Alexander's blood ran cold. "Hear her?" Lila nodded. "Not like a ghost. Not scary. Just in my heart. Like when you think something really hard and you feel it. She tells me things. She tells me when you're sad." He stared at her, searching for any sign of deceit. But she was only a child. A lonely, frail child with no reason to lie. And yet, the thought chilled him to the bone. That evening, he returned her to her aunt's house. The building sagged with age, its paint peeling, the yard littered with rusted cans. The woman who opened the door looked weary, her eyes hollow. "You again," she muttered, eyeing Alexander's suit. "What do you want with her?" "I'm just making sure she's safe," Alexander replied, his tone sharp. The woman snorted. "Safe? She's fine. She keeps herself busy. Doesn't cause trouble. Why are you bothering with her?" Alexander's jaw clenched. He had half a mind to tear into the woman, but Lila's small hand tugged his sleeve, silencing him. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm used to it." The words shattered him more than any insult. As he drove away, Alexander gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. No child should ever be used to neglect. And yet, Lila bore it with quiet strength. Days turned into weeks. Each time he returned to the cemetery, Lila was there. And each time, the grave had risen a little more. The mound swelled as though Amelia's memory were clawing its way back into the world, refusing to let go. One afternoon, Alexander brought a bouquet of lilies. He placed them on the grave, his hands trembling. "She deserved better than me," he whispered. Lila glanced up at him. "She still loves you, you know." He laughed bitterly. "I wasn't there, Lila. I chose money over her. She called me the night she died, and I told her I couldn't come. I chose a deal over my own daughter." Lila's gaze softened. "She forgave you." The words nearly undid him. He turned sharply, voice breaking. "How do you know that?" Lila touched the soil gently, her tiny fingers tracing Amelia's name. "Because she tells me. At night. When it's quiet." Alexander's heart pounded. He wanted to deny it, to dismiss it as imagination. But something in him resisted. Something needed, to believe. The breaking point came one night when Alexander returned late to the cemetery. He had been unable to sleep, plagued by dreams of Amelia crying out for him. The moon hung low, bathing the grave in silver light. And there was Lila, curled up asleep against the headstone, her teddy bear cradled under her chin. For a moment, Alexander simply stood there, his chest aching. Then he lifted her gently into his arms. She stirred but didn't wake, her face pressing against his shoulder as though she trusted him completely. The sensation was foreign, warm, painful. He carried her back to his car and drove her to the mansion. That night, he laid her on the guest bed, tucked a blanket around her small frame, and stood watching. She looked so fragile in the vast room, but she breathed evenly, peacefully, as if this cold mansion had finally given her the safety she'd been denied. And as Alexander stood there, he realized something terrifying. He cared for her, not out of pity, not out of guilt, but truly, deeply. It was as though in helping Lila, he was being given one last chance with Amelia. One last chance not to fail. But his mind couldn't rest. The grave continued to rise, and the connection between Amelia and Lila gnawed at him. The following day, he visited Mrs. Callahan again. She eyed him warily as he entered her small home, filled with crosses, faded photographs, and the scent of lavender. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low. "The grave. The letters. The way it grows." Mrs. Callahan nodded slowly. "The dead don't rise for no reason, Mr. Harrington. Sometimes they call out because something is unfinished." He clenched his fists. "But what does it mean? Why this child? Why Lila?" The old woman's gaze softened. "Perhaps because she carries something your daughter left behind. Perhaps because she is what your daughter needed you to see." Alexander frowned. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Callahan shook her head. "You'll know when the time is right." Her cryptic words haunted him. Back at the mansion, Lila sat at the kitchen table, her teddy bear propped beside her as she colored with crayons he'd bought her. When Alexander walked in, she looked up, her face lighting with a smile. "You're home," she said simply. 2 words. And yet they undid him, because no one had ever said them to him like that before. Not with such warmth. Not with such truth. For a moment, he stood frozen, his chest aching. Then he moved closer and sat beside her. "Lila," he said softly, "do you ever feel like Amelia is inside you?" She blinked. "Sometimes, but not in a scary way. More like, she whispers to me. She makes me brave." His throat tightened. Tears blurred his vision. And then, without realizing it, Alexander reached out and pulled Lila into his arms. She hugged him back fiercely, small arms clutching his neck. In that embrace, Alexander felt both broken and whole. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Because if the grave still grew, if Amelia's presence still lingered, then there was more he had yet to face. Much more. The storm rolled in heavy that night, drenching the city in rain that beat against the Harrington mansion's tall windows like a relentless drum. Lightning cracked over the skyline, casting brief, sharp shadows through the glass. The house, normally cold and silent, now echoed faintly with the sound of a child's laughter. Lila had made a fort in the living room, stacking pillows and draping blankets, her teddy bear sitting proudly on the throne she'd built from cushions. Alexander, still in his loosened tie and rolled-up sleeves, stood by the doorway watching her. It was surreal, like watching a ghost from his past. Amelia had done the same once, building castles out of chairs and quilts, waiting for her father to crawl inside and pretend to be the king. He never had. "Are you going to just stand there, or are you going to help me guard the castle?" Lila's voice broke through his reverie, soft but commanding. He blinked. "Guard it? From what?" Her eyes twinkled. "From the storm giants, of course." Something in him softened. With a reluctant chuckle, Alexander crouched down and ducked under the blanket. The scent of lavender from the fabric mixed with the faint sweetness of the child's shampoo. Inside the dim fort, she had lined up crayons like weapons, a bowl of popcorn like treasure. "You'll take the left," she whispered, pressing a plastic spoon into his hand as if it were a sword. "I'll take the right." For a man who once controlled empires, who signed papers that shifted economies, the absurdity of holding a spoon as a weapon should have been laughable. But in that moment, with her small figure crouched beside him, eyes gleaming with innocent courage, he felt something stir inside him, something he had long buried. He wasn't Alexander Harrington, the billionaire, anymore. He was just a man who had failed his daughter, and this child was giving him a second chance. They sat together as the storm raged outside, lightning flashing through the curtains. Lila pressed close, her head resting on his arm without hesitation. For a long while, they said nothing, and yet the silence between them was not empty. It was full of unspoken forgiveness, of fragile trust. The storm worsened, flooding roads and toppling power lines. By morning, the city news declared many streets impassable. Even the Harrington estate, with its long driveways and stone gates, was cut off by fallen trees. Lila couldn't leave. The realization settled over Alexander as he stood at the window, watching rain continue to fall. For the first time, he didn't feel dread at being trapped. Instead, there was something almost relieving about it. Lila padded into the room, still in the oversized pajamas one of the maids had found for her. Her hair was a halo of tangled curls, her teddy bear dragging at her side. "Can I stay?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Alexander turned, and something in her eyes, the fear of rejection, the bracing for disappointment, struck him. He crouched down to meet her gaze. "You can stay as long as you want." Her face broke into a smile that could have lit the mansion better than any chandelier. Days blurred together as the storm continued to batter the city. With the power flickering on and off, Alexander's mansion felt less like a fortress and more like a shelter. But strangely, he didn't mind. He found himself doing things he hadn't done in years. Cooking simple meals, reading stories by candlelight, listening. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Lila curled up beside him on the couch, her teddy bear wedged between them. "Mr. Harrington," she whispered, "do you ever wish you could start over?" The question cut him to the bone. He stared into the flames of the fireplace. "Every day," he said softly. She tilted her head. "With Amelia?" His throat closed. "Yes." For a long moment, the only sound was the fire crackling. Then Lila's small hand found his. "Maybe this is your chance." He looked at her, startled. Her eyes glistened with something beyond her years, something that seemed borrowed from a soul much older. It wasn't just Lila speaking. He felt it. Somewhere inside her, Amelia's presence stirred. The thought both terrified and comforted him. One night, unable to sleep, Alexander wandered into Amelia's old room. He hadn't stepped inside since her death. Dust cloaked the shelves. Her toys lay untouched, her bed still neatly made as though waiting for her return. And there, on the nightstand, sat a small music box. He turned the key slowly. The familiar lullaby trickled out, fragile and sweet. It was the song Amelia had always asked him to hum when she was afraid of storms. Behind him, he heard a sound. He turned. Lila stood in the doorway, her teddy bear limp at her side. "That's the song," she whispered. He froze. "What did you say?" Her eyes filled with tears. "That's the song she sings to me when I'm scared." The music box continued its delicate tune, filling the room with ghostly echoes. Alexander's knees buckled, and he sank to the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. It was impossible. It was unbearable. And yet, it was real. Lila walked in quietly, climbed onto the bed, and leaned against him. "She doesn't want you to hurt anymore," she said softly. His shoulders shook as he pulled her into his arms. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Lila pressed her small hand against his chest. "But she thinks you do." As the storm kept them trapped together, Alexander realized he no longer wanted it to end. He found himself cherishing the small things, the way Lila's laughter echoed through the halls, the way her footsteps softened the silence, the way her presence filled the empty spaces Amelia had left behind. For the first time in years, he felt alive. But beneath that warmth lay a question he could no longer ignore. Why Lila? Why did Amelia's grave rise only when this child appeared? Why did she carry Amelia's memories, her whispers, her forgiveness? The answer hovered just out of reach, taunting him. And he knew, with bone-deep certainty, that when the storm cleared, he would have to seek it. Because if he didn't, he feared he would lose both Lila and Amelia all over again. The skies cleared slowly, as if reluctant to release the mansion from the storm's grip. Branches littered the driveway. The garden had transformed into a swamp of puddles, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. Yet inside Alexander Harrington's mansion, the world had shifted into something far more profound than mere weather. The storm had forced him and Lila together, forced him to listen, to remember, and to feel. But storms don't last forever. And now, With the sun breaking timidly through the clouds, reality began knocking on the walls of his newfound sanctuary. The world outside would soon demand explanations. Who was this little girl? Why had she appeared? Why was his daughter's grave mysteriously disturbed? And most haunting of all, why did Lila carry fragments of Amelia inside her? The morning after the storm lifted, Alexander found himself staring out of his study window. The grounds were a mess, gardeners already at work clearing debris. But he wasn't watching them. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in a web of questions he couldn't ignore. Behind him, the door creaked open. Lila shuffled in, dragging her teddy bear, her hair wild with sleep. She climbed wordlessly into the large leather chair opposite his desk and stared at him. "You're leaving me, aren't you?" she said suddenly. His heart clenched. "What makes you say that?" "Because everyone does," she replied matter-of-factly. She hugged the teddy bear tighter. "They get scared of me. Or of her." Alexander leaned forward, his hands gripping the desk. "Lila, no one is leaving you. Not me. Not anymore." She tilted her head. "Then why do you look like you're going to run away?" Her words pierced him, sharp and unflinching. She was right. He was scared. Not of her, but of the truth she carried. That afternoon, Alexander arranged a meeting with the orphanage director. The woman arrived pale-faced and nervous, her eyes darting around the opulent mansion as though afraid to touch anything. "Mr. Harrington," she began softly, her fingers tightening on her handbag. "You wanted to know more about Lila?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Everything. From the beginning." The director hesitated. "Some of what I'll tell you may sound unbelievable." Alexander gave a humorless smile. "Unbelievable is my daily life now." "Start talking." Lila had been abandoned at the orphanage's gates 5 years earlier, swaddled in a blanket far too thin for the winter night. No note. No name. Just a baby with eyes too old for her face. She never cried, the director said, her voice trembling. Not once. Even as an infant, she was different. When other babies wailed, she watched. When toddlers stumbled, she helped them up, even though she could barely walk herself. Alexander frowned. Different how? The woman swallowed. She'd say things no child her age should know. Once, when she was 3, she told a caretaker that her other daddy was sorry he missed tea. The caretaker thought she was making it up. But later, when we looked through the papers, we found that Amelia, your Amelia, always had tea with you every Sunday before you left for work. Alexander's breath caught. He gripped the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. She would talk about places she'd never been. The park you used to take Amelia to. The toy shop you closed down years ago. Even names of Amelia's friends. "Impossible," Alexander whispered. The director leaned forward. "Mr. Harrington, some of the children whispered that she had a spirit inside her. Others avoided her. But Lila, she would always say the same thing. I have a sister who still needs me." The words crushed him. His chest heaved as though the air itself was too heavy to breathe. Could it be? Could Amelia's spirit, the child he had buried, have found refuge in this little girl? Lila appeared in the doorway then, her teddy bear dangling at her side. Her wide eyes locked on him. "Did she tell you?" she asked quietly. Alexander's throat was dry. "Who?" Lila stepped closer, her voice lowering. "Amelia." The room seemed to tilt. His hands shook as he pushed himself to his feet. "How do you know that name?" "I never told you." Lila's lips trembled. "Because she tells me things. She's with me when I sleep. She's with me when I'm scared. She says you're finally ready to listen." The orphanage director gasped softly, clutching her chest. But Alexander could barely hear her. His ears rang with Amelia's name, spoken by a child who should never have known it. Ready to listen to what? His voice cracked. Lila's eyes filled with tears. To the truth about the night she died. The room fell silent. Alexander's world spun violently backward to that night. The screech of tires, the rain on the windshield, the phone call that had shattered his soul. But no one had ever told him how Amelia's accident had truly happened. He had buried the details under wealth and grief, too afraid to face them. Now, staring at this little girl with tear-streaked cheeks, he realized Amelia had never left. She had been waiting all this time, clawing her way back through Lila to tell him what he had refused to hear. That evening, he sat with Lila by the fire, his heart pounding as he whispered, "Tell me." Her small fingers clutched his hand tightly. Her eyes closed. When she spoke, her voice trembled but carried a strange weight, as if more than one soul was speaking through her. Daddy, you promised you'd be at my play. You said you'd come, but you didn't. I waited and waited, and then I got into the car with Mom. Alexander's chest burned, tears streaming down his face. He had forgotten the play, or perhaps buried it deep to escape the shame. The rain was heavy, Lila continued, her voice distant, as though echoing from far away. Mom kept looking at the clock. She was upset. She didn't see the other car until her voice cracked and she sobbed. I wasn't ready to go, Daddy. I was scared. Alexander's body shook with violent sobs. Amelia, oh God, Amelia. And then, Lila whispered, her eyes snapping open, filled with something not entirely her own. I found her. She was lost too. She was lonely. So I stayed. I carried her. Until you were ready. Alexander pulled her into his arms, clutching her as though she were life itself. He buried his face in her hair, broken. I'm ready now. I swear I'm ready. Her small arms tightened around his neck. Then don't let me go. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He wandered to Amelia's grave once more, the soil still disturbingly fresh as though stirred by invisible hands. He sank to his knees in the mud. The wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers that only he seemed to hear. He pressed his hand against the gravestone, tears soaking the earth. I hear you, he whispered. I hear you now. I won't run anymore. I won't fail you again. And for the first time in years, the earth seemed still. No rising soil. No disturbed ground. Just peace. The mansion no longer felt like a mausoleum. Lila's presence filled the echoing halls with warmth, with sound, with the kind of life Alexander had thought he would never experience again. But along with that warmth came a reckoning he could no longer avoid. If what Lila said was true, if Amelia had stayed bound to her, whispering through her soul, then his daughter hadn't been able to rest all these years because he hadn't allowed her to. His grief, his silence, his refusal to face the truth had tethered her spirit to this world. Now he owed her something. Something greater than his empire, greater than his wealth. He owed her peace. But peace came with choices. And Alexander Harrington had never been good at choosing love over power. The following week, Alexander summoned his lawyers and board members to the mansion. For years, his empire had run on autopilot, his money multiplying through cold hands and soulless ledgers while his heart lay in the grave. But when the men and women in suits gathered around his table that morning, they found a man they no longer recognized. I called you here today, Alexander began, his voice heavy but steady, because there are changes coming. Effective immediately, I am stepping back from day-to-day control of Harrington Global. Gasps rippled around the table. One man, red-faced, slammed his palm down. You can't be serious, Harrington. This company is your life, your legacy. Alexander's gaze hardened. No, my daughter was my legacy, and I lost her while I was too busy chasing numbers on a page. He paused, his voice cracking. I will not lose the second chance I've been given. The silence that followed was deafening. Some looked outraged, others bewildered. But Alexander didn't care. For the first time, their opinions didn't matter. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out, leaving behind the empire he had once thought defined him. That evening, Lila found him sitting in Amelia's room, the music box turning slowly, its lullaby filling the air. Are you sad? She asked softly, climbing onto the bed beside him. He shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. Not sad. Free. She studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small smile, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper. I drew something for you. He unfolded it carefully. The crayon drawing was childish but powerful. A tall man with silver hair, a little girl with pigtails, and beside them, a glowing figure with a halo of yellow. It's us, Lila whispered. Me, you and her. Alexander's heart broke and healed all at once. But peace would not come so easily. Whispers spread quickly through the city. The media wanted to know why the billionaire recluse had suddenly stepped down. Reporters hounded his gates, helicopters circled his estate, tabloids spun stories of madness, of illegitimate children, of hidden scandals. And at the center of it all was Lila. Protecting her became his only mission. He kept her close, homeschooled her, shielded her from the cameras. But the world had a way of prying open even the tightest of gates. One afternoon, as they returned from the cemetery, they found photographers waiting, their flashes blinding. Mr. Harrington, who is the girl? Is she your daughter? Your heir? Why are you hiding her? Lila clutched his hand tightly, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. She looked terrified. Alexander crouched beside her, shielding her from the chaos. He whispered fiercely, "Look at me, Lila. Only me. Don't listen to them." Her wide eyes met his. And in that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. He stood, holding her hand, and faced the crowd. "This is Lila," he said, his voice carrying with unexpected strength. "She is not my blood. She is not my heir. But she is my daughter in every way that matters." Gasps erupted. Cameras flashed wildly. "She came into my life when I thought I had nothing left. And through her, I have learned that love is not about what we build or what we own, but about what we give." If you want a story, write this. A man who failed his daughter was given a second chance, and he will not waste it. The reporters shouted more questions, but Alexander didn't answer. He lifted Lila into his arms and carried her inside, shutting the gates on the world. That night, as they sat together in the quiet, Lila whispered, "You told them the truth." "I told them what mattered," he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Amelia's smiling." His breath caught. "She is?" Lila nodded, her eyes closing. "She says she can rest now, because you finally see her." Tears streamed down his face as he held her close. The music box played softly in the background, its notes tender and final. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something he had long forgotten. Peace. But peace was never the end of the story. A few weeks later, as spring touched the city, Alexander took Lila to the cemetery once more. They carried flowers, lilies for Amelia, daisies for Lila to place. When they reached the grave, Alexander stopped dead in his tracks. The earth was no longer disturbed. The grave had stopped rising. The soil was firm, the grass green. And carved into the stone, though no mason had touched it, were new words etched beneath Amelia's name. "Thank you, Daddy." Alexander dropped to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching the stone as though he could hold his daughter through it. Lila knelt beside him, wrapping her small arms around his shaking shoulders. "She's free now? You both are." And in that sacred silence, Alexander Harrington finally understood. His wealth had never been the true treasure. His daughter's forgiveness, carried through the heart of another child, was the gift he had been searching for all along. The spring air carried with it a kind of rebirth. The rains had passed, leaving the city washed and clean, as though even the heavens had purged themselves of grief. Alexander Harrington stood at the tall window of his mansion, his reflection staring back at him, a man he barely recognized. No longer hollow-eyed and broken, but softened, weathered, and somehow alive again. Behind him, Lila's voice echoed through the halls, faint but vibrant. She was singing to her teddy bear, inventing songs about castles and angels. The sound drifted through the mansion like sunlight through open curtains, chasing away shadows that had lived here for far too long. He turned from the glass and listened. For years, silence had been his only companion. Now, laughter and music danced in the air, filling the void Amelia's absence had left behind. Still, even as peace settled, a gnawing fear remained deep inside him. What if it was all temporary? What if Amelia's spirit, having finally been released, would now take Lila from him too? The thought gripped his heart with icy fingers every time he watched her sleep, every time she ran into his arms. He had lost one daughter. Could he truly endure losing another? That fear reared its head the night Lila collapsed. It happened suddenly, as twilight painted the sky pink and gold. She had been chasing fireflies in the garden, her laughter rising like bells. Then, without warning, her small body crumpled to the grass. "Lila!" Alexander's voice tore through the air as he sprinted toward her, his knees hitting the ground beside her limp figure. He scooped her into his arms, his chest seizing with panic. Her eyes fluttered open weakly. "I'm okay," she whispered. But she wasn't. Alexander rushed her to the hospital, the same sterile walls he hadn't stepped inside since Amelia's death. The smell of antiseptic hit him like a fist, dragging him back into memories he had fought so hard to bury. Doctors and nurses swarmed, their voices a blur as they took Lila from his arms. "We'll take care of her, sir." But those words had failed him once before. He paced the waiting room like a caged lion, fists clenching, heart racing. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not when she had become the very reason his heart still beat. Finally, the doctor approached, her face solemn but calm. "She's stable," she said. "She fainted due to exhaustion and malnutrition. Her past, it's catching up to her. We'll need to run more tests." Exhaustion, malnutrition, words that painted a picture Alexander had not fully allowed himself to imagine. How many nights had Lila gone hungry before he found her at Amelia's grave? How much suffering had she endured, carrying both her own burdens and Amelia's whispers inside her? His chest tightened with guilt. He had been so consumed by what Lila had given him that he had forgotten to ask what weight she carried. When they finally allowed him into her room, she looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, wires attached to her arms, her teddy bear tucked under her chin. Her eyes flickered open when he sat down beside her. "You scared me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to," she murmured, her voice faint. He took her hand, fragile and warm in his. "Lila, you don't ever have to carry anything alone again. Do you hear me? Not hunger, not fear, not even Amelia's whispers. I'm here. I'll always be here." Tears welled in her eyes. "Even if she leaves me?" Alexander swallowed hard. "Even then. Especially then. Because she's not leaving you, sweetheart. She's letting you live. And I'll be right beside you." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then she smiled weakly. "You're like a daddy again." The words shattered him and healed him all at once. He pressed her hand to his lips, his tears falling freely. "No, Lila. I'm your daddy now. If you'll have me." Her tiny fingers squeezed his. Forever. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital visits, treatments, and fragile hope. Lila's health slowly improved, her laughter returning bit by bit. Alexander was there for every step, reading her stories, bringing her favorite snacks, even learning to braid her hair, badly, but she didn't mind. But something deeper shifted inside him too. For the first time in his life, he understood that love was not about control or perfection. It was about presence. It was about choosing, day after day, to stay when it was hard, to fight when it was hopeless, to believe when everything screamed not to. He had failed Amelia, but with Lila, he would not fail again. Months later, when spring had given way to summer, the adoption papers were finalized. Alexander stood in the courthouse, Lila's hand in his, as the judge smiled down at them. "Do you understand, Mr. Harrington, that this child will now be yours in every legal sense of the word? That she will inherit not only your name, but your responsibility, your protection, and your love?" Alexander's voice was steady, unwavering. "Yes, she already has." The gavel struck. It was official. Lila Harrington. When they left the courthouse, photographers swarmed again, their questions loud, their cameras flashing. But this time, Alexander didn't shield her. He held her hand high, letting the world see. Because this was not a scandal. This was salvation. And as they walked down those steps together, Lila whispered, "She's really gone now. Amelia. She says she's happy." Alexander's throat tightened. "What did she say?" Lila smiled. "She said, 'Thank you for being the dad she always knew you could be.'" His knees nearly buckled under the weight of it. But then Lila squeezed his hand, steadying him, grounding him. And in that moment, Alexander Harrington, billionaire, widower, father broken by grief, finally understood his true legacy. It was not his empire. It was not his wealth. It was the love of two daughters, one who had forgiven him from beyond the grave, and one who had given him the chance to be redeemed. That night, back at the mansion, they lit candles in Amelia's room. The music box played its familiar lullaby as Lila set a daisy on the windowsill. "Good night, Amelia," she whispered. "Rest now." Alexander wrapped his arm around her, his voice soft but steady. "And good night, my girls. Both of you." The room glowed with a peace that felt eternal. And for the first time in decades, Alexander Harrington knew what it meant to truly live. Not as a billionaire, not as a man of power, but as a father. Forever. The city never stopped buzzing. Even after stepping down, even after retreating into a life that had little to do with boardrooms or balance sheets, Alexander Harrington's name remained in headlines. Billionaire recluse adopts orphan. Harrington, heir no longer bloodline. Harrington empire leader turned family man. But inside the gates of his estate, none of it mattered. What mattered was the sound of Lila's laughter as she rode her bicycle down the driveway, her training wheels rattling on the pavement. What mattered was the way she tugged at his sleeve to show him a drawing she made or a flower she picked from the garden. What mattered was the peace in her smile when she finally slept through the night without trembling from nightmares. And yet, despite these tender moments, the question lingered. Who was Alexander Harrington now? For years, he had defined himself by his empire, his wealth, his power. Now, stripped of all of it, he stood in the quiet with a second chance beating in his chest, and he wasn't sure if he deserved it. The choice loomed before him like a mountain. Would he step fully into this new life, humble, vulnerable, unknown? Or would he let fear, guilt, and pride drag him back into the hollow shell of the man he once was? It was Lila who sensed it first. One evening, she found him in the library, staring at shelves filled with untouched books and binders of old company reports. His hand rested on the spine of one, his eyes distant. "You miss it," she said softly. He startled, looking down at her. "What? The other world. The one where you were busy all the time." He opened his mouth to deny it, but her gaze, so sharp, so innocent, cut through him. He sighed, sinking into the leather chair. "Sometimes I wonder, without all of that, who am I?" She climbed onto his lap, her small hands resting on his chest. "You're my dad." The words were simple, but they hit him harder than any boardroom debate, any hostile takeover, any headline ever could. "I'm your dad," he repeated, his voice breaking. "And that's more important than being anything else," she said firmly. "Amelia told me once, before she left, that she didn't care about money. She only wanted you. Just you." His eyes burned with tears as he pressed his forehead against hers. Out of the mouths of children came truths too profound for men who had wasted lifetimes chasing the wrong things. Still, the outside world was relentless. One afternoon, a former board member visited the mansion, uninvited but insistent. Robert Kessler, a man Alexander had once mentored, strode into the study with the smug air of someone who believed he still had leverage. "You've made your point, Harrington," Kessler said. "The public loves the redemption arc. But it's time to stop playing house. Come back. The company needs you." Alexander stood tall, his expression cold. "No, Robert. You need me. You need my name, my shadow, my power. But I don't belong to that world anymore." Kessler sneered. "You're throwing away everything you built for a girl that isn't even yours." Before Alexander could respond, a small voice from the doorway cut through the tension. "She is his," Lila said, clutching her teddy bear. Her chin lifted, defiant. "I'm his daughter, and you can't take him away." Kessler faltered under the weight of her words. For a moment, his arrogance cracked. Alexander crossed the room, placing a protective arm around her. "You heard her," Alexander said firmly. "She's my daughter, my everything, and that will never change." Kessler left soon after, defeated. And as the door shut behind him, Alexander realized something. The choice had already been made. Weeks later, on a warm summer night, Alexander and Lila sat on the back porch watching fireflies dance in the yard. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think my legacy was my company, my wealth, my name." Lila leaned against him, her small hand in his. "What is it now?" He looked up at the stars, his heart full in a way it had never been. "You. My legacy is you." She smiled, her eyes shimmering like the night sky. "Then I'll make you proud." "You already have," he whispered. The fireflies glowed around them like tiny souls, and Alexander felt Amelia there, too. Not haunting, not tethered, but watching with peace. And in that moment, he knew, the future was not about rebuilding what he had lost. It was about living in what he had found. The choice was made. He would no longer be Alexander Harrington, billionaire, empire builder, untouchable king of steel and glass towers. He would simply be dad. And that was enough. The cemetery was quiet that morning. Dew clung to the grass like scattered pearls, and the early sun painted the sky in hues of gold and rose. Alexander Harrington walked slowly down the familiar path, his steps measured, his heart steady in a way it hadn't been in years. Beside him, Lila held his hand, her small fingers wrapped securely around his. She skipped a little to keep up with his long stride, her eyes darting curiously to the gravestones that lined their way. They stopped before Amelia's grave. It looked different now, not disturbed, not growing mysteriously in the night. Instead, it was trimmed neatly, surrounded by flowers that Lila herself had insisted they plant. Pink roses, daisies, little wildflowers she had picked from the edge of the estate. Alexander stood silently, his throat tightening as he read the name etched into the stone. His daughter. His first daughter. His greatest wound. His deepest love. "Hi, Amelia," he whispered, his voice low and reverent. "It's been a while." Lila squeezed his hand. "Can I say something too?" He nodded, stepping back. The little girl knelt on the grass, brushing her fingers over the carved letters. "Hi, Amelia. It's me, Lila. I've been taking care of your dad, just like you wanted. And he's been taking care of me too." She paused, her voice trembling with sincerity. "I know I'm not you. I can't ever be you. But I promise I'll make him happy, so he doesn't cry so much anymore." Tears spilled down Alexander's cheeks before he could stop them. The honesty of her words, the purity of her heart. It was as though Amelia herself had spoken through her. "You've given me back my father," he murmured, his voice breaking. "And I'll never forget it." They stayed there for a long while. Alexander told Amelia about the garden they were planting at home, about the nights spent reading bedtime stories, about the laughter that now filled the halls of the mansion instead of silence. And as he spoke, he realized something profound. The grave no longer loomed like a wound that refused to heal. It was no longer a place of torment, mystery, or punishment. It was a place of memory, of connection. A place to honor, not to fear. For the first time, the soil didn't seem to grow. It rested at peace. Months passed. Seasons changed. And with them, so did Alexander. He no longer woke each day to the echo of boardroom battles or the gnawing emptiness of unchecked grief. Instead, he woke to the sound of Lila's footsteps pattering down the hall, her voice calling out, "Daddy, breakfast." He woke to the smell of pancakes they tried, and often failed, to make together, to bike rides in the park, to evenings spent stargazing on the porch. Slowly, the billionaire in him faded away, replaced by something richer, something no amount of money could buy: fatherhood. And though whispers still followed him in society, critics questioning, investors speculating, he stopped caring. For the first time, his worth wasn't tied to their approval. His worth was sitting across the dinner table, smiling with syrup on her chin. But one evening, as autumn returned, Lila asked the question he had dreaded. "Daddy, what happens if I grow up and leave?" Like Amelia did. The words froze him. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then he knelt beside her, cupping her face in his hands. "You will grow up," he admitted softly. "And one day, you'll have your own adventures, your own family. But you'll never leave my heart. Not ever." Amelia didn't. "And you won't either." Her eyes shimmered. "Promise." He kissed her forehead. "Promise." And in that promise, he felt Amelia's spirit settle at last. Years later, long after Lila had grown into a strong, compassionate woman, Alexander often returned to Amelia's grave. He never came alone. Sometimes Lila joined him, sometimes her children. They always brought flowers, always kept the soil neat, always spoke to Amelia as though she were still part of their family circle. Because she was. The grave never grew again. It no longer needed to. It had spoken its truth. It had called Alexander back to love, back to fatherhood, back to life. And he had listened. Now, standing before it as an old man, Alexander smiled through his tears. "Thank you, Amelia," he whispered, "for giving me another daughter to love, for not letting me drown." The wind stirred the flowers, and he felt her there, gentle, forgiving, eternal. And for the first time in a long, long life, Alexander Harrington knew he had found what he had been searching for all along. Not wealth, not power, not legacy, but redemption and love.
Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this one, then you'll absolutely love the next. It's even crazier and more captivating than you can imagine. So go ahead and click the video showing right here on your screen, and I'll see you in the next story.